In the spring of 1978, a letter arrived at the Barron's farm in Poweshiek County, Iowa, that was about to start a war between a 62-year-old farmer and one of the largest railroad companies in America. The letter came from the legal department of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, known to everyone in Iowa as simply the Rock Island. The Rock Island had been running trains through Poweshiek County since 1863, when the first rails were laid across the Iowa prairie to connect the Mississippi River to the Missouri. The tracks cut through the county in a straight line from east to west, bisecting farms, splitting townships, and carving a path through some of the best agricultural land in the state. Willis Barron's 240 acres sat on both sides of those tracks. The Rock Island's right-of-way, the strip of land the railroad owned or had easement on, ran through the middle of his property, splitting the farm into a north half and a south half. Willis's cattle crossing, a gravel path under a small railroad bridge, connected the two halves. His hay meadow was on the south side. His barn and house were on the north side. The railroad had been there since before Willis's grandfather bought the farm in 1919, and Willis had lived with the trains his whole life. The sound, the vibration, the schedule that became as natural as sunrise. The letter said the Rock Island was exercising its right of eminent domain. Let me explain what that means, because the law is the weapon in this story. Eminent domain is the government's power to take private property for public use, as long as the owner receives just compensation. Railroads had been granted this power since the 1830s. If a railroad needed your land, it could take it. You could argue about the price. You couldn't argue about the taking. The Rock Island's letter informed Willis that the railroad needed to widen its right-of-way through his property by 40 feet on each side, 80 feet total, to accommodate a new passing siding. A grain terminal was being built in Malcolm, 6 miles east, and the single-track main line needed a siding so that eastbound and westbound trains could pass each other without stopping. The siding would run for 2 miles through 3 farms, including Willis's. The taking would consume approximately 4.5 acres of Willis's land, 2 1/4 on each side of the existing tracks. That doesn't sound like much on a 240-acre farm, but those 4.5 acres included Willis's cattle crossing, which would be eliminated to make room for the wider corridor, and they included the northern edge of his hay meadow, which would be graded and gravelled for the rail bed. Without the cattle crossing, Willis couldn't move his herd from the north pasture to the south meadow without driving them 2 miles down a county road to the next crossing. Without the hay meadow, he'd lose 12 acres of his best forage ground, the ground that fed his cattle through the winter. The letter offered $12,000 in compensation. $12,000 for 4.5 acres that by themselves were worth about $9,000, but that, in the context of the whole farm operation, were worth far more because of what they connected. Willis read the letter twice. Then he drove to town and hired a lawyer. The lawyer, a man named Phil Carmichael, who practiced out of a converted house on the square in Grinnell, read the letter and gave Willis the news that every farmer facing eminent domain has heard since the railroads were built. They can take it, Willis. The law is on their side. We can argue about compensation. $12,000 is probably low, and we might get 18 or 20, but we can't stop the taking. Eminent domain is eminent domain. So I lose my cattle crossing. You lose your cattle crossing. And my hay meadow, the northern edge, about 12 acres. And my farm gets cut in half with no way to cross except 2 miles down the road. That's what they're proposing, yes? Willis sat in Phil's office for a long time. He looked at the letter. He looked at the map that the railroad had attached. A clean, precise survey drawing that showed exactly where the new right-of-way would fall, with Willis's farm reduced to 2 disconnected pieces separated by a widened railroad corridor. What if I say no? Willis asked. Then they file a condemnation action. A judge appoints a commission to determine fair compensation. You get whatever the commission decides, and the railroad takes the land. It takes 6 months to a year. You can appeal the compensation amount, but you can't appeal the taking. So the answer is no matter what, they take my land. That's the law. Willis stood up. Phil, I appreciate your time. Send me a bill. What are you going to do? I'm going to think about it. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table with his wife Lorraine and told her what the lawyer had said. So we lose the crossing, Lorraine said. That's what the law says. And the meadow, 12 acres. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised Willis. Not because it was out of character, but because it was so precisely in character that it cut through everything. Your grandfather bought this farm in 1919. He paid $11,000 for 240 acres. The railroad was already here when he bought it. He built around it. He built the cattle crossing. He built the fences. He arranged the whole operation around that railroad. And the railroad never bothered him because it didn't need to. Now, 59 years later, they want to take 4.5 acres and destroy everything he arranged. That's about right. And they're offering $12,000, less than what Grandpa Behrens paid for the whole farm. That's also about right. Willis, your grandfather didn't buy this farm so a railroad could cut it in half whenever it felt like it. And no law written by men who've never farmed a day in their lives is going to change what this land means to this family. Willis looked at Lorraine. She was 59 years old, had been a farm wife for 38 of those years, and had never, not once in their marriage, told Willis what to do about the farm. She made suggestions, she asked questions, she offered perspective, but she never gave orders. This wasn't an order either. It was a declaration, and Willis recognized it the way he recognized weather, by the feel of it, the weight of it, the certainty that it carried. What are you saying? Willis asked. I'm saying don't let them take it. Phil says the law. I heard what Phil says. I'm not talking about the law. I'm talking about what's right. Now let me tell you about Willis Behrens, because you need to understand the man before you understand what he did. Willis was 62 years old and had been born on the farm, literally in the upstairs bedroom, in January of 1916. He'd lived on that land every day of his life except for 3 years in the Navy during the war, the Pacific, 43 to 46, and he'd come back certain that the land at home was where he belonged. His grandfather, August Behrens, had built the cattle crossing in 1922. Willis knew this because his father had told him the story 100 times. How August had negotiated with the Rock Island for permission, how he'd poured the concrete abutments himself using a hand-mixed batch that took 3 weeks, how he'd laid the wooden deck beams with 2 neighbors and a team of draft horses. The crossing was August's engineering, rough, overbuilt, practical, just a path under the tracks wide enough for cattle to pass single file. August had built it because a farm split in half isn't a farm, it's 2 fields with a wall between them. The crossing made the farm whole. Every morning, Willis walked his cattle through it from the north pasture to the south meadow. Every evening, he walked them back. He'd been doing it since he was 10 years old, approximately 18,000 times over 52 years. The path was worn smooth by generations of hooves, a groove in the earth that marked the daily rhythm of the Behrens farm as clearly as a clock marks hours. The railroad wanted to fill that groove with gravel and steel. They wanted to erase 56 years of August Behrens's concrete and Willis Behrens's cattle and Lorraine Behrens's patience. Willis was not going to let that happen. Let me tell you what he did the next morning, because it's the image that this entire story turns on. At 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the day after the letter arrived, the day after the lawyer said he couldn't fight it, the day after Lorraine said don't let them take it, Willis Behrens drove his 1953 Farmall Super M out of the barn down the lane, across the hay meadow, and onto the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad tracks. The Farmall was 25 years old. It weighed about 6,500 pounds. It had 48 horsepower and a turning radius that could put it squarely across two rails. Willis positioned it carefully. Front wheels on the north rail, rear wheels straddling the south rail, the tractor sitting perpendicular to the track direction, completely blocking passage. He shut off the engine. He climbed down. He sat on the rail beside the tractor, facing east, the direction the trains came from, and he waited. Let me tell you about the first train, because it arrived at 7:42 that morning, and the engineer's reaction set the tone for everything that followed. The Rock Island ran 4 trains a day through Poweshiek County, 2 eastbound, 2 westbound. The 742 was the morning eastbound freight, pulling 67 cars of grain and merchandise from Des Moines to the Mississippi River transfer point at Davenport. The engineer saw the tractor from about a mile out. At first, he thought it was a crossing accident. A farmer's tractor stalled on the tracks. He started braking. The train slowed. As it got closer, the engineer realized the tractor wasn't stalled. It was parked, deliberately, with a man sitting on the rail beside it. The train stopped about 200 yards from the Farmall. The engineer blew the horn. Willis didn't move. The engineer blew it again. 3 long blasts. The emergency signal. Willis sat on the rail and looked at the train the way a man looks at a thunderstorm, with respect, but without fear. The conductor walked forward along the tracks to where Willis was sitting. "Sir, you've got to move this tractor. You're blocking a mainline railroad." "I know. This is a federal offense. Obstruction of interstate commerce." "I expect it is. Are you going to move it?" "I am not." The conductor stared at Willis for a long moment. Then he walked back to the train and radioed dispatch. Within an hour, there were 4 people at the site. The train crew, a Rock Island section foreman, and a young man from the railroad's legal department in Des Moines who had driven out at a speed that probably violated several traffic laws. The young lawyer, his name was Kevin Doherty, 28 years old, 2 years out of Drake Law School, walked up to Willis with the confidence of a man who had the entire legal framework of American railroad law on his side. "Mr. Behrens, I'm Kevin Doherty, counsel for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. You are currently obstructing a Class 1 railroad main line, which is a federal crime under Title 18, Section 1511 of the United States Code. I'm instructing you to remove your vehicle from the tracks immediately." Willis looked at the young lawyer. Clean suit, polished shoes, now muddy from the walk along the tracks, a briefcase, a face that had never been sunburned because it had never spent a full day outdoors. "Son," Willis said, "I've been sitting on this rail since 6 o'clock this morning. I've been farming this land since 1940. I've been looking at these tracks since 1916, which is the year I was born. You've been looking at them since about 20 minutes ago. So let me explain something to you." He pointed east, toward the stopped train. "That train is sitting on my land, not the railroad's land. My land. The original right-of-way through this property is 60 feet wide. Your train is on that 60 feet and I've never objected. But the letter I got yesterday says you want 40 more feet on each side. That's my hayfield. That's my cattle crossing. That's my livelihood." He pointed at the farmhouse. "This tractor is sitting on the 60 feet the railroad already owns. I'm not blocking anything that isn't yours. But until somebody explains to me why a railroad that's had 60 feet for 115 years suddenly needs 140, and why my cattle crossing and my hay meadow have to die for it, this tractor is staying right here." Kevin Doherty opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Mr. Behrens, regardless of your grievance, obstructing a railroad, call the sheriff. I'll wait." Kevin called the sheriff, the Poweshiek County sheriff, a man named Bob Trueblood, who had grown up on a farm 3 miles from Willis's place arrived at 10:30. Bob looked at the tractor. He looked at Willis. He looked at Kevin Doherty. "Willis," Bob said. "Bob, you're blocking a railroad. That's what they tell me. I'm supposed to arrest you." "I know." Bob looked at the train, which was now 3 hours late. The engineer was sitting in his cab, reading a magazine. The conductor was leaning against a fence post, smoking. Kevin Doherty was on his car phone, the kind that weighed 11 pounds and had an antenna on the roof, talking to his supervising attorney in Des Moines. "Willis, if I arrest you, they'll just tow the tractor and run the train. Then they'll have to tow the tractor. That's a 1953 Farmall Super M. It weighs 3 tons and the parking brake is set. They'll need a wrecker, and the nearest wrecker big enough is in Grinnell. That's 45 minutes each way. Add another hour for setup and tow. They're looking at another 3 hours minimum. You've thought this through." "I've had since yesterday." Bob Trueblood did something that Kevin Doherty did not expect. He took off his hat, scratched his head, and said, "I'm going to get some coffee. I'll be back in about an hour, maybe 2. I suggest everyone use the time to think about what they really want here." He drove away. Kevin Doherty stood on the tracks, his polished shoes completely ruined now, watching the sheriff's car disappear down the county road, and realized that he was in a jurisdiction where the sheriff was a farm boy, the farmer was a local hero, and the railroad was the outsider. Let me tell you about the next 6 months. Because Willis Behrens didn't just park his tractor on the tracks for one day. He parked it there, or was prepared to park it there, for 6 months. The railroad had the tractor towed that afternoon. Willis was not arrested. Bob Trueblood had quietly told Kevin Doherty that arresting a 62-year-old farmer for protecting his land would not play well in the local papers, and that the county attorney would probably decline to prosecute. The next morning, the Farmall was back on the tracks. The railroad had it towed again. Willis put it back. The railroad had it towed a 3rd time. Willis put it back a 4th time. By the end of the first week, the Rock Island had spent $4,200 on towing fees. The morning eastbound freight had been delayed 4 out of 5 days, and the story had been picked up by the Grinnell Herald-Register, the Des Moines Register, and 3 television stations. Farmer parks tractor on railroad tracks to fight eminent domain. The headline was everything. It was David and Goliath. It was one man against a corporation. It was a red tractor on steel rails, and a farmer who wouldn't move. The story went beyond Iowa. The wire services picked it up. Letters started arriving at the Behrens farm, from farmers in Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, farmers who had lost land to eminent domain, farmers who were fighting pipeline companies, highway departments, power companies, farmers who had been told the law is the law and had accepted it, and now watched a 62-year-old man from Poweshiek County refuse to accept it and wished they'd done the same. Willis received over 300 letters in the first month. He answered every one by hand, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, writing in the careful cursive his mother had taught him, telling each person the same thing. "I'm just a farmer who doesn't want to lose his crossing. If that helps you, I'm glad." Lorraine handled the phone calls, dozens of them, reporters, radio stations, a television crew from Cedar Rapids. She screened every call, declined most, and agreed to one, a reporter from the Des Moines Register named Janet Halloran, who spent 3 hours at the kitchen table. Janet asked Willis why he didn't just take the money and build a new crossing somewhere else. "There is no somewhere else," Willis said. "My grandfather tested 3 locations before he poured the concrete. 2 had drainage problems. The 3rd, where the crossing is now, sits on a gravel bed that drains naturally. He didn't build it there by accident. He built it there because it was the only place that worked. The railroad offered a new crossing half a mile south, but half a mile south is clay soil. It'll flood every spring, and half a mile south means my cattle walk an extra mile every day. You want to explain to my cows why they need to walk extra because a railroad in Des Moines drew a straight line on a map. Janet's article ran on the front page of the Register's Iowa section. The headline was "Poweshiek Farmer Won't Move for Railroad," or his tractor. It was syndicated to 14 Iowa newspapers. The railroad tried a different approach. Kevin Doherty's supervising attorney, a senior partner named Martin Gaines, who had been doing railroad condemnation work for 20 years, drove to Poweshiek County personally. Martin Gaines was not Kevin Doherty. He was 54, experienced, and smart enough to know that this situation had moved beyond legal tactics. The railroad was losing the public relations war. Every day that Willis's tractor sat on the tracks or was towed off and put back was another day of coverage, another round of sympathy for the farmer, another erosion of the railroad's public standing. Martin asked for a meeting. Willis agreed. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Lorraine had told Willis not to let them take it. "Mr. Behrens, I'm here to find a solution," Martin said. "The railroad needs the siding, but we don't need a war. I don't need a war either. I need my cattle crossing and my hay meadow. The siding requires 80 feet of additional right-of-way. I understand the engineering. What I don't understand is why the 80 feet have to come from my hay meadow when there's 100 acres of open ground east of my property that belongs to nobody." Martin paused. "What do you mean, belongs to nobody?" "I mean the Hoffman Tract, 80 acres east of my fence line. Been in tax delinquency since '74. County owns it. Nobody farms it. It's growing up in weeds and volunteer trees. You could run your siding through there without touching a working farm. We surveyed the corridor. You surveyed a straight line. Straight lines are easy for engineers and hard on farmers. Bend the line 50 yards south at my east fence, run it through the Hoffman Tract, and bend it back at my west fence, you get your siding. I keep my crossing and my meadow. The county sells you the tax-delinquent land for whatever it's owed in back taxes, probably less than you're offering me." Martin Gaines looked at Willis Behrens, at the overalls, the calloused hands, the face that had been weathered by 62 years of Iowa wind, and realized he was sitting across from a man who had not only refused to accept the taking, but had designed an alternative that was better for everyone involved. "You've been thinking about this," Martin said. "I've been thinking about this since the day I got your letter. I drove the Hoffman Tract the next morning, walked the whole 80 acres. The soil's poor. That's why Hoffman abandoned it. But soil doesn't matter for a rail bed. Gravel matters. And that ground is flat, well-drained, and exactly where your siding needs to be if you bend the line 200 feet south. Your engineers drew a straight line on a map in Des Moines. I've been looking at this ground for 46 years. I know where the water drains, where the soil holds, where the grade works. Your siding will be better on the Hoffman Tract than on my meadow, because my meadow floods in spring and the Hoffman ground doesn't." Martin was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Willis had been waiting to hear. "I need to talk to our engineers." "Take your time. The tractor's not going anywhere. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 4 months, because the resolution was as quiet as the confrontation was loud." Martin Gaines took Willis's suggestion back to the Rock Island's engineering department in Chicago. The engineers were resistant at first. The original survey had been approved, the condemnation papers were filed, and changing the route meant new surveys, new environmental assessments, and new legal filings. But Martin was practical. He calculated the cost of continuing the fight: towing fees, legal fees, train delays, public relations damage. He compared it to Willis's alternative: purchase the Hoffman Tract from the county for about $4,000 in back taxes, resurvey the route for $15,000, refile plans for 5,000, 24,000 total, versus 60,000 and climbing for the condemnation, plus a public relations disaster affecting the Rock Island's relationships with farmers across central Iowa. In September of '78, 6 months after the letter arrived, 5 months after the first tractor-on-tracks incident, the Rock Island sent Willis a new letter. The railroad was withdrawing its condemnation action against the Barrens' property. The siding would be built through the Hoffman Tract, on a route that bent south at Willis's east fence line and returned to the original corridor at his west fence line. Willis's cattle crossing would remain. His hay meadow would remain. His farm would remain whole. Willis read the letter at the kitchen table. Lorraine sat across from him. "They're not taking the land," Willis said. "I know. The siding goes through the Hoffman Tract. I know. My crossing stays." Lorraine reached across the table and took his hand. They sat there for a while, not saying anything, because some victories don't need words. The Farmall went back in the barn that afternoon. It had been parked on the railroad tracks, or been ready to be parked on the railroad tracks, 11 times over 5 months. It had been towed 7 times. It had caused approximately 46 hours of train delays, and it had cost the Rock Island more in towing, legal fees, and public relations damage than the Hoffman Tract cost them to buy. A 6,500-pound tractor had beaten a corporation that owned 12,000 miles of track. Let me tell you about the aftermath, because the tractor on the tracks was just the beginning. The Rock Island built the siding through the Hoffman Tract in the fall of '78. The route worked exactly as Willis had predicted. Flat, well-drained, no flooding. The Rock Island's own engineers later admitted, quietly, that the Hoffman route was superior to the original plan. Willis never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The trains ran past his farm on the new siding every day, and every day the cattle crossing was still there and the hay meadow was still green. The Rock Island went bankrupt in 1980. 2 years after the Barrens dispute, the line through Poweshiek County was eventually taken over by the Iowa Interstate Railroad. The siding is still in use. The Hoffman Tract route is still the route, and Willis's cattle crossing is still there. The crossing his grandfather built, the crossing the railroad tried to take, the crossing a Farmall Super M protected. Willis Barrens farmed until 1989. He was 73. His son Craig took over the 240 acres, whole, uncut, connected by the crossing that a railroad tried to destroy and a farmer refused to lose. Willis died in 1997 at 81. His funeral was at the Methodist Church in Grinnell, a bigger service than anyone expected, because word had traveled. Farmers from 3 counties came. Phil Carmichael came. Janet Halloran, the Register reporter, came. She'd kept in touch with Willis for 19 years, visiting the farm once a year for what she called the best interview I never have to ask questions for. Bob Trueblood came, retired now, still drinking coffee at the same pace. Craig spoke at the service. He talked about the crossing. "Every morning of my childhood, I walked through that crossing with my father and the cattle. Rain, snow, mud, heat, didn't matter. The cattle went south in the morning and north in the evening, and my father walked with them through a concrete underpass that his grandfather built with his own hands. That crossing wasn't infrastructure. It was the heartbeat of the farm. And when someone tried to stop that heartbeat, my father sat down on a railroad track and said no." He paused. People called what my father did a protest. It wasn't. It was a refusal. A protest is against something. A refusal is for something. My father wasn't against the railroad. He was for the crossing. He was for the farm that his grandfather built, and he intended to pass on whole. 2 people sent flowers who nobody expected. Martin Gaines, the senior railroad attorney, sent a card that read, "He was right, and he made us better for it." The other was Kevin Doherty, Phil Carmichael, the lawyer who told Willis the law was on the railroad side, came to the farm after the resolution. He stood at the crossing, looked at the tracks, and shook his head. "Willis, I told you the law said they could take it." "You did." "The law did say that. The law said a lot of things. My tractor said something different." Phil laughed. "You know what you did isn't in any law book. Maybe it should be. Maybe there should be a law that says before a railroad takes a farmer's land, it has to look at what it's taking and ask if there's a better way. Not a cheaper way. Not a faster way. A better way. There is such a law, actually. It's called common sense, but they don't teach it in law school." Kevin Dougherty, the young railroad lawyer who'd stood on the tracks in his polished shoes and cited Title 18, left the Rock Island in 1979. He went into private practice in Grinnell, of all places. He specialized in property law. He represented farmers. Years later, someone asked Kevin why he'd switched sides. "Because I stood on a set of railroad tracks and watched a 62-year-old farmer teach me more about property rights in 10 minutes than I learned in 3 years of law school." He didn't cite a single statute. He just pointed at his hay meadow and said, "That feeds my cattle." And I realized that all the law in the world doesn't matter if you forget what the land is for. The Farmall Super M is still on the Barron's farm. Craig keeps it in the barn, maintained on the same schedule Willis followed. Oil every 50 hours, grease every week, valve adjustment every 500 hours. The tractor is 73 years old. It's been on the railroad tracks 11 times, and it's never lost. Craig's daughter, Amy, is 16. She asked her father once why Grandpa Willis put the tractor on the tracks. "Because the railroad wanted to take our crossing," Craig said. "But wasn't that illegal?" "Probably." "Wasn't he scared?" Craig thought about it. "Your grandfather was a man who weighed about 170 pounds, and he parked a 3-ton tractor in front of a 200-ton locomotive because he believed his hay meadow mattered more than the railroad schedule." "Was he scared?" "I don't think so. I think he was the opposite of scared. I think he was certain." "Certain of what?" "Certain that some things aren't for sale. Not for $12,000. Not for any amount. The crossing, the meadow, the farm. Those aren't assets on a balance sheet. They're the reason we're here. And when someone tries to take the reason you're here, you don't negotiate. You sit down on the rail and you wait. Sometimes the smallest thing in the frame is the most powerful. Sometimes a tractor weighs more than a locomotive, not in tons but in meaning. And sometimes a man sitting on a railroad track, doing nothing, refusing to move, saying almost nothing, is the loudest voice in the county. Willis Barron's didn't have the law on his side. He didn't have money, or lawyers, or political connections. He had a Farmall Super M, a hay meadow, a cattle crossing, and the absolute refusal to let a corporation solve its problem by destroying his. The railroad sent a locomotive. Willis sent a tractor. The locomotive blinked first.